So it's a group exhibition that focuses on what stories might be told by people returning back from zones of conflict or people that may have lived in zones of conflict. So really it separates from kind of a broader faceless perspective, say for example politically when politicians refer to our troops or the troops that serve in various conflict zones, and which reduces that down to kind of a mass, and this story really looks at what these individual narratives and individual stories might be. So whereas, and I'll bring this again back to the politics of this, when the Abbott government and governments before that have alluded to, when they talk about bringing the troops back, returning the troops, looking at that politically as an end game, this exhibition really looks at that point as the starting point for what happens next. The exhibition title is called On Return and What Remains, so that really points the exhibition in a direction of focusing on what it is for somebody to come back, somebody to return to their homeland. In this respect, we're really discussing returning troops, but it also kind of looks at what remains. And so within that, I guess there's parallel things running within that, which are the things that remain in these countries where these conflict zones where, say for example, Australian troops fight and then return, but also, I guess more emotionally and psychologically, what remains of that experience for many of these people returning back, and then what is thereafter conveyed through or passed down to their loved ones, to their communities, to their families. So it really looks at what the sort of the harrowing stories might be told from an individual narrative about what it is like to serve in these kinds of contexts and then try and return and re-enter and normalise society. By way of example, in the work of Harun Farocki, which is one film within his Serious Games series that he made in 2009. And in that series of works, he worked very closely with American troops at their training facilities in the United States. And so he was granted quite unprecedented access for a filmmaker to film the kind of the training mechanisms that are at play in contemporary American warfare. This particular work that we're showing within this project looks at new strategies that have been employed by military psychologists working with the US troops to try and reintegrate American troops back into civilian life or to prepare them for the next future tour of duty. So in this instance, the work follows technologies that American troops have been using in terms of simulators to prepare their troops, and these are used quite commonly around the world as well, in preparation for entering into combat zones. So this has been something that's been in various ways worked through for decades now, and as computer technology becomes more sophisticated, there is more reliance on these as a training mechanism. In recent times, these same sorts of simulators, same sorts of virtual technologies have been used to attempt to treat troops that are returning back from conflict areas as well. In the instance of immersion, which is the work that we're showing at ArtSpace, it follows military psychologists as they explain how these different systems are working. And what they do is they invite troops into a therapy session and they put on the simulator onto their head. They get a foreground of everything, of the particular root of their traumatic experiences. And then they recreate those virtually while these troops are essentially reliving and reenacting these traumatic experiences as a way to try and really put them psychologically and physically and virtually back into that same context that led to whatever psychological difficulties that they face upon their return. So in many ways, you get to see the troops reliving these experiences as if they were living them for the very first time. So there are a number of synergies that carry through different works within the exhibition. Possibly a good or an interesting segue out of Harun Farocki's work is a newly commissioned work by Baden Pailthorpe. Baden has been employing similar sorts of animation technologies as have been used and pioneered and used by the military to, in some ways, try and think about what the present is and what the future might be of modern warfare. And in that, I'm not talking really specifically about particular zones of conflict, but really about how these wars might be fought. So this particular work focuses on the use by the American military of drones, increasing use of drone warfare. So in this work, he tries to chart what these connection points might be from the troops that are operating these drones in Nevada in the United States, in prefabricated compounds, what that sort of the impact of them controlling something that essentially is going thousands and thousands of kilometers away to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and then them essentially kind of pulling the trigger on potential insurgents or potential kind of areas of conflict. So what that kind of disconnect might be, physical disconnect might be, he's trying to illustrate in an exceptional kind of virtual sense. The exhibition structure in many ways sort of starts off in a way that kind of limits people's access into the space. People walk into a very darkened space. It takes some moments for one's eyes to acclimatize to the darkness. It's about, well, in many ways it kind of references in the initial stages kind of early trench warfare, but then begins to open out and kind of expand the kind of the synergies between the works. Within that logic, the show ends in some ways with a midpoint because audiences are kind of forced to traverse the same trajectory that they've entered through the works to enter into the space. So this midpoint or endpoint is a work by Israeli-born, Berlin-based filmmaker, artist Omer with a fantastic work that he made in 2012, which some people may have seen at Documento when it was shown there in that year. And that work really, it starts to unravel, as with much of his works, the whole ability or capacity of film or video to kind of represent truth, full stop. But within this work, it also really looks at what the psychological ramifications might be for a family as they welcome home their son. The story descends into increasingly psychotic episodes, so it's once again really difficult to kind of work out what this tension is between truth and reality as the family, the German couple welcoming home their son from Afghanistan, struggle to kind of realign each other's experience and to try and start off as if nothing's happened in the duration of his tour of duty. So it's a 40-minute work that repeats a chapter 3 times over, told in quite different ways. The film starts off with a middle-aged German couple driving through the forest in regional Germany, picking up their son, Daniel, from a station, waiting by himself. They drive back to their house. They try and remind him that this is the house that has grown up in, that they've kept his room the same, that they can, in some ways, he can return there as if he's just gone away for a weekend away. They sit down and have dinner. They sort of talk about various banal things before the son starts to get into kind of details about his experience there, or starts recounting stories. And it becomes very evident that the family have no real way of empathizing with or understanding the situation within which he's been. So these stories are repeated in many ways, 3 times over. The next day, the family, the mother and father, once again drive through the forest to the same train station, pick up what you assume to be their son again. As it turns out, the son is still named Daniel, played by a different actor. They return home, a different set of unusual and increasingly kind of psychotic episodes happen over the dinner party as well. Once again, with the family trying to kind of pretend like nothing's happened, the son trying to pretend like he's not really in this new situation as he's struggling to come to terms with what it's like to be back in the familial home, back what it might be like to be in civilized society. So as this story repeats a third time again, becoming increasingly unbelievable in many ways, becoming increasingly estranged from any sense of reality. The audience starts to question, whether this is really happening, whether the family has hired an actor or a series of actors to act the role of their son as they struggle to come to terms potentially with his loss. So in much of Omer's work, this shares the same quality of being left exceptionally ambiguous in terms of both the narratives that he's trying to explore, but also the capacity of film to portray or represent an idea of truth.
And just the dynamic that is opened up, these kind of lines of trauma between the various family members.
Sure, trauma and denial of trauma. And I think there's really interesting parallels between Omer's work in terms of that sort of rippling on or that transference of trauma to the work that inaugurates the exhibition, being the two sculptural works by Bonita Eli. So the two works that we're presenting within this exhibition are called Watchtower and Sewing Machine Gun. And Watchtower takes form as the marital bed of her parents and the cot that she slept in as a child, refashioned into a World War II era watchtower, sort of looming up within the space and looking down upon a 303 Vickers machine gun that's been beautifully fashioned from a 1940s Singer sewing machine. So I think it's really important that the materials that Bonita's using are domestic materials of that age, almost through that kind of a feminine perspective on how that trauma might be passed down from a father to his wife, to their children, and more broadly out into the community. I think it's important to note that a lot of the works within the exhibition have come from personal experiences. Some have drawn on extensive research within the area, but some very much are calibrated around very much a personal narrative or personal relationship to the subject matter. The work of Richard Mosse, Irish artist Richard Mosse, is perhaps a fine example of that. In 2009, he worked as an embedded journalist in Iraq with US serving troops. So he's gone through as the troops that he was working alongside and seen some of the traumatic events that kind of played out during that particular tour within which he served. In conjunction or in relationship to that work as well, we're showing two fantastic new works by Sydney-based artist Khadim Ali, who is a Hazare who was born in Afghanistan, lived most of his life in exile in Pakistan, has firsthand suffered the trauma of this situation, of this political, geographical and social situation. His family's home was blown up by suicide bombers. His own son has suffered many of the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder following on from these events. So I think it's really important to stress that not all of these works are kind of about war, but some have really come from the place where these wars have taken place.